In today's cosplay tutorial video, I'll show you how I made my Marcille cosplay from Dungeon Meshi, and there'll be timestamps below if there's a particular component of the costume you're looking for. One thing I wanted to mention, since I might get comments about it, is that I had started on this costume before the anime had come out, so I was basing the coloring more on her manga design, which is a bit darker and more muted, than her anime design, where it's a bit more brightly colored. The pattern I'm using is from Indigo Patterns, and it is a digital print-at-home pattern. So you start by printing out the first page, making sure the box is to scale. Then you can print out the rest of the pages, tape them together, and cut them out. Before we begin, I'm going to have to make some modifications to the pattern. First off, as you can see, the skirt is way too long on me. I ended up taking the length off in two places. First, I trimmed off about 4 inches from the bottom. I was worried that only taking material off at the bottom would make the pleats seem rather disproportional, so I wanted to take some material off around the waist area. However, because of the angle of everything, I can't just cut it off the top, so instead I cut the pattern at this line here, brought it down by 1 inch, so this piece came down just fine. This one, there was a little bit of a gap, so I just took an extra piece of paper and smoothed it back up so that there wouldn't be a strong L shape cut out of it. And here's what the new pattern piece looks like. Repeat the process for the skirt back pattern piece so that the changes are symmetrical. In case you hadn't noticed yet, I'm short, so the sleeves were also too long on me. And I can't just cut it off the bottom because then I'll lose this little flappy bit that she's got at the bottom. So instead, I just sliced it, brought it down by 3.5 inches, and then added paper to smooth the lines back out. The main fabric I'm using for Marcelle's dress is a dark blue linen. And here are all the pieces all cut out. I took the outer pieces of the dress and serged around the edges to help keep them from fraying. The only thing is that for all of the bodice pieces, I left the armholes raw because we're going to finish them later on. Because of the pleats in the front of the dress, we're going to be sewing this a little bit differently than your typical dress. So we've got our front skirt piece, and then we're going to sew on the front bodice pieces to the corresponding skirt bits. And here's what the dress piece looks like so far. Putting right sides together, we're going to sew the bodice pieces together along the side to the edge of the pleat, and the pattern instructions say to go about 1.5 centimeters beyond where this fold is. Fold the material into the pleats, following the markings on the pattern, then iron it into place. The pattern instructions also mentioned sewing a line of stitching here to anchor the material into place. Personally, I didn't like that look of having the line of stitching on there, so I just sewed a little bit. You can barely see on camera, which is what my goal was, but I just sewed in that line there to act as an anchor, but also so the stitching wouldn't be visible. For the decorative stitches on Marcelle's skirt, I decided to go ahead and do this now before I assemble the dress, just to make it easier on myself. And to do that, I marked the placement using disappearing white pen. This is supposed to disappear when you iron it, so hopefully these marks will go away. Then I used a darning needle and some embroidery floss for the really big stitches, and then since they were kind of just wobbling all over the place, I then used a regular needle and regular thread to just tack them in the middle so that they're nice X's and not wobbling. Repeat this process for the dress back pieces as well. Sew the dress back together along the center back seam and insert a zipper. Sew the front and back of the dress together along the shoulder seams and the side seams. Take the facing pieces and apply some fusible interfacing and serge the edges. And again, I left the armholes bare because we'll be finishing them later on. Sew the facing pieces together along the shoulder seams and the side seams. Putting right sides together, we're going to sew the facing to the neckline of the dress, and at the zipper, we're going to be folding the edges inward so that they line up. Sew the seam allowance down towards the facing. This will encourage it to stay inwards. Then we're going to trim away the excess. Next, we're going to connect the facing and the outer part of the dress together at the armhole. And to do that, I just used a serger. To further secure the facing, I turned the dress inside out and put it on the dress form, and then hand sewed some tacking stitches to secure it to any of the seam allowance that was inside the dress. I also folded the edge of the facing inward on either side of the zipper, and I'm going to hand sew it into place. Moving on to the sleeves of the dress, we're going to fold the sleeve pieces in half and sew them together along the bottom edge and up to the notch so we get that little flappy bit that her sleeve has. Hem the opening of the sleeve, and I also went ahead and added the decorative stitching. Sew some gathering stitches along the top of the sleeve between the notches. Sew the sleeves onto the bodice. Finish off the bottom edge with just a regular hem. And with that, Marcelle's dress is done. For her cape, again, I'm using the pattern from Indigo Patterns, and for the fabric, I'm using a lighter blue linen. I went ahead and cut all of the pieces out of the linen, and I pinned them onto the dress form mostly just to keep the pieces together, because some of them look pretty similar to each other. Sew the center front piece to the middle front piece on both sides. For the stripe at the bottom of the cape, I'm using this beige stretch sateen, and the reason I'm going with this instead of a brighter yellow is because my color scheme seems to be following a bit more of the manga rather than the anime. I cut out all of the beige pieces. The pieces say to use interfacing, however, since my fabric's a bit on the thicker side, I decided not to. Then sewed them on to the corresponding blue parts. Once we have all of the yellow strips sewed on, we can go ahead and sew all of the cape pieces together. Repeat the process a second time to create the lining. For the piece that's going to become the outer portion of the cape, on the second seam, we're going to fold it and press it towards the opening instead of pressing it flat, and this is because it'll give us just a little bit more thickness for the stitching. Speaking of the decorative stitching, I got some embroidering floss to use for that. I wanted something a bit thicker than usual thread so it would stand out. And a bit of a tip, when you're going shopping for thread, try to bring some scraps of the material with you so you can do your best to color match. So the stitching isn't perfect, but I think it gives it a fun kind of homemade look. Putting right sides together, sew both the lining and the outer part of the hood together along the center back. Putting right sides together, we're going to sew the hood to the hood lining all along the opening. Turn the hood right side out and press it. Then I went ahead and sewed a line of stitching along the bottom of the hood, and this is inside the seam allowance. It's just to keep the two pieces together. Sew the hood onto the outer side of the cape. Putting right sides together, we're going to sew the cape outer to the cape lining all along the outer edge. And as you can see, we're leaving a space open so it can be turned right side out. Also, the hood is tucked in inside and sandwiched in between the two pieces. Turn right side out and hand sew the hole closed. To close the cape, I sewed on a hook and eye to the inside of the opening. For the bow on the front of the cape, I just cut a piece of red satin ribbon that I had in my stash. Sew the ribbon together to create a loop. Gather the center down to create a bow and hand sew it onto one side of the cape. And with that, Marcelle's cape is done. To make the pants, I'm using this Definitely Not Rey from Star Wars pattern. I made this years ago and I still had it in my stash, so that's why I'm using it, because it's almost what Marcelle wears. I'm just gonna lengthen a little bit so it's the right length. And the fabric I'm using is this really soft, stretchy knit material. The pattern calls for a non-knit material, but this should work just fine. So I cut the pattern piece where it says lengthen or shorten here, moved it by an inch, and now I'm going to cut out the slightly longer pants pattern. Putting right sides together, we're going to match up a back and a front and a back, and sew them together along the inside of the leg. Putting right sides together, we're going to sew the two halves of the pants together along the crotch seam. Putting right sides together, we're going to sew the side seams. Fold the pants cuff in half and sew it together along the side. Then we're going to fold it in half again, so that we have this kind of donut shape. Gather the bottom edge of the pants and sew on the cuff. I used a serger for this because I wanted more practice, so mine are a little lumpy, but it's good enough. Fold the top of the pants over and sew it into place, leaving a space open so we can insert the elastic. Thread the elastic through the waistband, then sew the two ends together. Pull the elastic into the channel and sew the hole closed. And now we have finished pants. For her necklace, I started by cutting a piece of red satin ribbon slightly smaller than the width of my neck. On one side, I used a jump ring to attach a spring ring clasp, And then on the other, I used a jump ring to attach a length of chain to make it adjustable. Now, I added this little, I think it's technically a Christmas ornament charm on the end, because this color reminded me of her color scheme, and I'm just not personally a big fan of leaving the end of the chain plain. I like adding a little decoration, even though no one's going to see it. And with that, Marcelle's necklace is done. For Marcelle's spellbook, I'm using this book that I got from the thrift store for $2. As the base. I know nothing about it, but it was the right color and size for her book. I then took it home and immediately put it in a Ziploc bag and put it in the freezer just to make sure it didn't have any mildew or anything like that. I used some nail polish remover to remove the lettering from the spine of the book. Unfortunately, this did damage the fabric binding though. I painted some fabric Mod Podge onto the spine of the book just to try and flatten down some of those fraying areas. Then for the gold detailing, I started by sketching out the design with a disappearing fabric pen. This will evaporate as time goes on. Then I could go over with some gold acrylic paint to add the details. And then with that, Marcelle's book is done. For Marcelle's pouches, I'm using the pouch pattern from Alice in Cosplayland, and this is again a digital print at home pattern, so you start by printing out the page with the test square and making sure that's to scale before printing out the rest of the pages and assembling them. The narrow book pouch pattern was the perfect size for the spine width of my book, but unfortunately my book was a little too wide this direction. So to fix that, I split it and added some extra paper back in, and now it's the correct width. I'm using two different vinyls for this project. The first is a brown for the smaller pouch, and then a lighter tan for the book pouch. Since Alice already has a step-by-step video for making these pouches, I won't be including that in this video. I'll put a link so you can go check it out. So the pattern has the straps on the back of the pouch going this way, which isn't as accurate to her design, so I put mine going the opposite direction. And this is the better way to do it, and I'll show you why. Since she's animated, Marcelle doesn't have to worry about silly things like physics or gravity pulling the book downward and looking really awkward. So now I'm going to put the straps back in so it goes this direction and lays a lot smoother. I didn't want to leave a bunch of scarring in the pleather, so I just sewed the new little straps on top of the old ones. And this is what it looks like with the new straps. I paired the pouches with some purchased belts, and now they are complete. For the base of her staff, I'm using a 3/4 inch PVC pipe and a styrofoam ring. I cut off part of the PVC pipe so that it would be accurate for my height. I also cut a piece out of the styrofoam so that way the PVC pipe will fit inside. I then used a hot glue gun to attach the styrofoam to the pipe. One thing I do want to point out is you want to be careful of the temperature. You don't want to melt the styrofoam because that has the potential to cause fumes. Then I covered up the gap using some foam clay. It's not perfect, but it's going to be covered up later anyways. The next step is to wrap the staff in twine to simulate branches. I then coated everything in Mod Podge to flatten the flyaways from the twine and to act as a primer. In case you were curious, it does dry clear. Next, I covered everything in some brown acrylic paint. Once the paint had dried, I poked a hole into the top of the staff. For the leaf at the top of her staff, I'm using this old rose that actually was from my Webyugioh cosplay ages ago. I cut away the leaves until I was left with this little two-prong leaf. Then simply glued the stem into place. And with that, Marcelle's staff is done. The base wig I'm using for Marcelle is from Wig Supplier. Here is what the wig looks like straight out of the bag, and it's actually pretty good. Here's what it looks like from behind. Again, it's got the braids, so it's already pre-styled. Only thing that I'm not the biggest fan of that I'm not sure I can really do anything about is that so many of the fibers at the top here are cut short. I don't know if that's like to save money or something. Since this is a pretty long wig, I went ahead and sprayed the back of it with detangler just to hopefully keep it from getting messed up while I'm working. For this hairstyle, Marcelle has her elf ears sticking out in between these two pieces of hair. However, for my head, that means I need this braid to be a little bit further down. I pulled the hair into a ponytail so that it would stay out of the way, then rebraided the side braids so that they would be a little bit lower on the head. All that's left was to brush out the back of the wig and add her little hair ribbon. And that means Marcelle is finally done. And now, for the reveal. Overall, I'm really happy with how this costume turned out. Since it's adventure clothes, it's really comfortable, and with the cape and dress being made out of linen, they're quite breathable. The only thing I would change if I was to wear this again would be to trim the braids a little bit shorter, though since Marcille changes her hairstyle basically every other episode, it's not really a big deal. I hope you found this video helpful, and thank you so much for watching. Bye!